today. I will be talking about unemployment and the cost of living and underemployment. There is so much for us to be covering. I am so excited to be here with you. You have done so much incredible work around this topic for so long, from the New York Times to CNN, now at the Globe. So yeah, I would love for you to, introduce yourself to folks.
Hey, everybody. And Jeremy, thanks so much for asking me. I know it's taken us a little while to finally get together, but we made it happen
Of
and
course.
things turned out the way that they needed to turn out. So thanks
Yeah.
again. My name's Tanzina Vega. Some of you may know my voice from public radio. Others may know my byline from CNN and the New York Times. And most recently, I'm a contributing writer for the Boston Globe op-ed section. And I also do research projects, large-scale editorial research projects. Just wrap one up about intergenerational leadership, which was always interesting, which was featured on the PBS NewsHour. And so I stay very much connected to the world of journalism and remain very, very, very focused on issues of inequality, which unfortunately, Jeremy, as you know, are only increasing across the board in our country.
Very much so. And, I think one of the ways that I first came across your work, which really resonated with me and, is something that's really important for the American Inequality newsletter is this work of telling stories that aren't often told, right? How we can peel back layers on what's going on in the US economy, in households, in communities. And you have really made that central to your work. So can you talk a bit about how you covered, that work that was previously uncovered, what that was like engaging with communities, households, and sort of how you got to those deeper issues?
Sure. I mean, this is something that, to borrow a term from Kimberly Crenshaw, intersectionality, right, is a lens that I put a lot of my work. And I don't want to be so academic about it. What does that mean? That means looking at the different ways that race and class and gender and education and upbringing and other things affect people's ability to achieve this so-called American dream, right? And when we look, or any issues that people are facing in the United States, we tend to look at things through a sort of dominant lens. And that lens, whether we're looking at it at healthcare or other industries, is often, the default is male and white. And that when we tend to talk about things in that way, we're losing so many other stories, right? We lose so many other perspectives. So one of the first things I did when I was a reporter, after reporting on tech for a while, was to really start to look at when we're talking about something, for example, the 1%, right? There was a while back, remember when everyone was talking about the 1%, right? Particularly after the protests and all of this
Yeah.
sort of the president, Trump's first election in 2016. My question was a simple one. Well, who's in the 1%? Right? When we talk about the 1%, can we please get specific on who we're talking about? So, of course, as a journalist, I decided, let me call up the St. Louis Fed and ask them, can we get some numbers around this, right? And sure enough, when we started examining the 1%, I found that, again, these are numbers based on the St. Louis Fed data crunched in about 2016. We found that 95% of the 1% are white Americans, right?
Mm.
Within the remaining 5% of a 1%, that's Black Americans, Latino Americans, Asians, and Native Americans, right? And other. And so what we're looking at here, when we start to demystify inequality, we're really looking at his history. We're looking at the different ways that policies have implemented different groups of people, because we need to look at things through that lens, right? We can't just assume, even now, there's a conversation happening about Gen X, of which I am a member, proud card carrying Gen Xer. And I keep thinking, are we talking about white Gen Xers, Black Gen Xers, women Gen X? Like who, when we talk about
Right.
even generations, who are we talking about, right? So that's the lens I try to bring to each story that I do, which really tries to get beyond whatever the dominant narrative is, or really tries to unpack how we got there.
Yeah, I think it's such a, simple but sort of undone, approach, which happens so often, which is just asking who are we talking about here, right? And actually trying to, drill down deeper. And I think that's the work of like a great journalist is trying to drill down and, sort of ask those questions that other people are sometimes missing. I know Piketty and Saez had also done a similar thing about drilling down to the 1%, where they sort of said, can we go even further? Can we talk about the 400 wealthiest, people in the US or globally, and start to uncover a bit there. So I'm glad to hear that that's sort of the lens that you take to a lot of this work. But let's talk about unemployment and what is going on with labor in America right now, because there is so much craziness happening, and we happen to talk basically an hour after the Bureau of Labor Statistics just announced that over the last year, they had overstated the number of jobs by about 911,000. So close to a million jobs that we thought we had that we actually realized we do not have. The last jobs report on Friday said that we added only 22,000 jobs in the last month. So unemployment has now ticked up to the highest point in the last 4 years. What have you been observing about unemployment in the US? It's a very, kind of intense labor market. 4.3% in some ways feels low, and maybe we think we're in a good job market, but I see you shaking your head already, so I'll let you dive in.
Yeah, I mean, I've started I wrote a piece last year for the Boston Globe opinion section, which took a look at this conundrum, shall we, right? What everyone was saying, but the economy's so good. Unemployment is so low. How come people are whining about not being able to find jobs? So I took it on and I thought, is some of this bad luck at the time a year ago? Yeah, some of it was bad luck. Some of it was artificial intelligence. Some of it was what was to come, right? And some of it was more than a gut feeling that I was having. It was really people saying, wait a minute, I can't find a job, or it's taking a long time, or my resume isn't getting read, right? And so
Right.
we started seeing the beginnings of this. Even the mainstream media, I have to say, was very, obtuse in the way that it refused to acknowledge this reality, right? Remember, I wrote an opinion piece about this. And so now that we're seeing the reality that so many people have been talking about, and I think we know what's happening. It's not what I think what's happening. We know that the federal government, first of all, took a massive hit, right, when it came to politically motivated firings and, purging of different departments, right, and personnel being laid off just, indiscriminately, frankly, regardless of who or what or why. So that's a big hit. That has been a huge hit to the job market, in particular for those folks who have degrees, whether they're PhDs, masters, bachelor's degrees. Like we're
Yeah.
talking about, an educated workforce and a professional white collar workforce that's been largely hit by this. Let's also not forget that companies are seeing record profits, but they're still doing layoffs, right? So we used to think that once a company got hit with bad numbers, we would expect layoffs. What we're seeing now is a combination of things. The threat of artificial intelligence, and I say that it didn't used to be considered a threat, right? It was just supposed to be considered something that we accept. But now we've got a bunch of CEOs who are saying, get back to the office or you're going to get fired. And oh, by the way, we might outsource your job to AI, right? So those are threats. The last time I checked, that's how you threaten somebody, right? You're going to lose your job if and when. So there are a lot of people who are under a lot of pressure right now, who are feeling that they're going to be marginalized out of their jobs. And some folks are already, leaning pretty hard into artificial intelligence, which is a whole nother part of our conversation. I'm sure we're going to get into about the effects of that long term. But these are the things that I've been noticing, on top of the fact that we need to remember the Biden administration issued guidelines around AI and workforce hiring. Those, I believe, are now largely being ignored, right? So you're adding to this issue people sending in hundreds of resumes, and they're just not even being read. Nobody's paying attention. Job listings are falling off. So all of this is creating this sense that things are wrong. But now when we see the updated numbers, we know that something has been off. And I should add that the numbers, you thought those numbers were bad. New York City, that's it, New York City only created 1,000 jobs. Was it a month ago?
Yeah.
New York City has 8 point some odd million residents. And we are like the capital of finance and, we can argue media and so many other industries, and that we could only create 1,000 private sector jobs is terrifying. So again, not to be doom and gloom, but this is pretty serious stuff.
No, I mean, the New York City stat, I think, and as a native New Yorker, is one, yeah, that similarly, really sticks with me, where I think it was over the first, 6 months of the year, it was only 1,000 jobs. So we were basically only hiring 5 people every day. And one of those was probably a healthcare worker, one of those was maybe at McDonald's. And so if you weren't one of those lucky 3 other people in, New York City to land a job, you were, yeah, out of luck. And so thinking about the labor challenges that we're having right now, and before going to AI, I want to talk about Times published a piece yesterday, or maybe 2 days ago, talking about what the effects of the crackdown on immigration might be for job seekers. And they hypothesized that because we are, seeing so many fewer immigrants in the US, so many fewer people applying to jobs out of, fear that there'll be retribution or that they'll be identified in certain ways. Like, I'm not sure if you saw that piece, but was that like a compelling narrative for you in some of this equation? Like, I know you didn't really mention sort of some of the effects of, yeah, immigration on, what we're seeing, and ICE crackdowns as well on unemployment. Does that resonate with you or not so much?
I mean, 3 days after the election, CNN invited me to the Abby Phillips show to talk sort of about, the quote unquote Latino vote. And I was less focused on that than I was about the sort of calls for mass deportations, right? Which
Mm,
are essentially illegal removals. Well, I don't know. Now they might be considered legal because the Supreme Court has ruled, quite interestingly over the past couple of weeks. But the point being is that the first thing I said was the only way to carry out this mass deportation is to do workplace raids, right? That was the only way that this was going to start to happen at scale. Right. You can do this one off on the street, which is what we're seeing, these horrific videos of people being taken off the streets. But now we're seeing, large scale workplace raids, right?
right.
So I would just want to say that the workplace is a place that's now become weaponized for a lot of folks. Secondarily, I'm not sure how many Americans have actually ever worked agricultural work. I had the fortune to do a story for the New York Times. In fact, on this was a bunch of years ago, on how many Latinos had gone from working in the fields to actually owning produce farms in Northern California. The story took me out to Northern California to watch everything from small scale organic farms to large scale Driscoll operations happening, with hundreds of workers. I can tell you that no matter what size farm I visited, no matter how well the workers were treated, the work itself is backbreaking. It is absolutely exhausting and backbreaking. I do not, however, want to put all Latinos into the boat of, workers who are working in the fields. We have folks who have also carried the burden of childcare in this country, right? Latino contributions to the economy have been enormous, right? We also are one of the groups that is considered to have increased the number of folks who have degrees, over the past 2 or 3 decades. So our contributions to the economy have been huge, right? We're looking at now, like there's been a question of, well, who's going to replace these workers, which I think is important, but also somewhat crazy because the workers are, these are people who aren't just employment and labor supply, but actually human beings. I do think that we are going to see retrenchment. I think that a lot of companies are thinking, well, we'll just get rid of folks through AI, through, other forms. At the end of the day, we're going to need humans in the workforce. I do not see, at least now, maybe I could be wrong, but a completely automated workforce. So what is that going to mean for American workers? I think we're going to see a large suppression of wages. I think people who are saying, oh, well, I'll do that strawberry picking job and I'll get paid, $9 an hour, would like to see how long folks are going to last. And we are seeing a contracting, job market right now. People cannot find jobs. How much is immigration or lack thereof going to affect that? At the professional class, I'm curious to know. I couldn't even tell you, but I do think that this is going to have long lasting effects, particularly, and I shouldn't forget to mention this, in the development of small business creation. I live in New York City. I live in Queens, which is the most diverse part of this country, I would argue. Okay. And if you go up and down Jamaica Avenue, any of these avenues that I live near, the number of small business immigrant small businesses that have sustained our community and sustained our country, That's
Yeah.
also something that I worry about. We're not just talking about childcare folks and folks picking in the fields. We're also talking about folks who are engines of the economy and who largely create small businesses as well.
Yeah, the weaponization of the workforce, and or the workplace, and yeah, thinking about that as this possibly dangerous zone for so many workers, and then wanting to avoid that space, out of fear of you know deportation. Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. And well, you were in Northern California for a story. I was in Southern California a few months ago, kind of also, talking with, many of the, pickers of, yeah, fruits and vegetables, heads of lettuce and alfalfa, for the upcoming book that I'm working on. And yeah, the conditions, it's very intense, and much of that can't, be automated, right? We don't yet have the technology that's, good enough, to sort of be, taking care of many of these vegetables. And so we will continue to very much so need, humans in the workforce for many different jobs. But it's, there's so many employers who are still, waiting on the sidelines to see what, this different technology can develop or cannot develop. And in the meantime, I think some of the biggest burdens are falling on, recent college grads, right? So there was a report came out last week from Eric Brynjolfsson at Stanford showing that, 22 to 25-year-old, recent graduates, particularly in software development jobs and some hospitality jobs, were really struggling to find, jobs, largely due to the effects of, artificial intelligence. But to this point, you had mentioned earlier about like job training. I had been, and also thinking about like solutions, right? We used to, in the US in the 1960s, have like this, manpower development training act, right? That Kennedy had implemented in the 1970s. We had a comprehensive as well, training act that got passed. But, I think it was in 1980, right? We had about $10 billion to help workers, who were displaced by, automation and new technologies. But by 1982, that 10 billion got slashed to 3 billion, right? We no longer do that same type of workforce training to help, workers sort of get back on their feet. And I think the result is exactly as you said. We see a lot of, wage stagnation that comes as a result of it. And you made the really critical point about like which demographics does this, disproportionately impact, and which industries are most going to suffer too. I think your point about, childcare, in particular, where we're already seeing, runaway costs, is a real, yeah, detriment to families and working mothers, in particular.
Oh, absolutely. And, I should add that one of the things that Sam Altman was in a podcast, I guess recently. I don't remember which podcast it was, but what I do remember were his comments about, he was asked whether or not, what his concerns were for the recent college graduates who were coming, graduating into this new world. And so his initial response was how great this is for recent college graduates who aren't going to have to deal with all the drudgery of work that I guess Gen X and the rest of us millennials have had to deal with, and instead they can literally go and be shot into rockets into space, and their lives are going to be just transformed by this lack of drudgery and this focus on creativity and technological advancement. And so maybe I don't think so for all the people, but what really was interesting to me was that Altman then said his concern was not the 22 to 25-year-olds who were going to be graduating. And in fact, he said, it's 10 years ahead is too hard to even imagine what that future would look like, which I then thought, well, why not just ask Chat GPT? But then
Right.
again, let me not get ahead of myself. So the chat can't tell us what's going to happen in the next 10 years. But what he did mention, and I thought this was, again, this is where my interests kind of lie now, is that he said he's concerned about the 60 plus folks
Yeah.
who
Can you talk
either,
about older workers? Yeah.
yeah, he said he can't see these folks either wanting to, he said, retrain or upskill, he says, or whatever the corporate folks are calling it today. And so my concern, and I mentioned this to folks at McKinsey about 2 summers ago. They, over at McKinsey, had a media day and invited a bunch of us to talk about artificial intelligence in the workplace. And I said, this all sounds great for people who are interested in, quote unquote, taking, the horns of their career and upskilling themselves and retraining themselves. I said, but there are many Americans who don't, can't, or won't be able to or want to, right? And that's a lot of different, things to consider. And I said, what do you say to those folks? And they
Right.
said, those are great questions, but we don't really have any answers to that. So the truth is, I
What
don't
what would
think
what would you say to them
I
then?
I would say that's actually bullshit. I would say that you do know, as Altman has just mentioned, that this is going to have a detrimental effect on older workers. Because here's the thing about older workers, right? It's not that they're more expensive, right? But the fact is the risk, and we're still a very ageist country, unfortunately. The risk and the likelihood that someone over 50, for example, and this was stated in the Wall Street Journal recently, if you are over 50 and you've already been through one layoff, right? The likelihood, there's a 1 in 5 chance that you will never find a job. Now that is terrifying because the last time I checked, 50 to 65 is a 15-year gap, which means that we have to make it. Those of us who are in our 50s have to at least make it to 65, earning some sort of income, right?
Right.
Which is then also, by the way, tied to your health insurance, right? So we've got this thing, and we're expected to live till we're 150 years old, and we're having kids. I have a 5-year-old. I'm 50 years old. Like, life has changed for a lot of folks, right? So older workers can't afford to just fall out of the workplace, be ignored by AI systems and the like. And we also can't afford to say we're just going to, not hire people over 50. Ultimately, that will have an effect on the economy as a whole, right? We have to keep remembering the more folks that are unable to work, the more folks that are, looking for unemployment. The folks want to just pay their bills. Like, I don't think anybody's out, yeah, some people want to be gazillionaires, but I think most people are just, can I just find a job, pay my bills, get some groceries, take 2 vacations a year, and live a normal life, right? And it's becoming increasingly difficult to do that. But for older workers in particular, I think the risks of doing that in this economy right now are pretty severe.
Yeah, and I know, this connection between employment and insurance is, in my mind, I don't know, such a quagmire that we have created in the US. And I don't know, the history of it is quite fascinating. But I think one of these other parts that you and I had talked about before was around the cost of living, right? And how when you lose your job, your ability to afford your rent, your groceries, your kids' school, childcare, really comes under dramatic stress. And particularly later in life, you have so many more responsibilities,
Right.
liabilities that you need to navigate. So why do you think it is that we aren't focusing more on the conversation around elder employment and the work that we could be doing there to make sure that the folks who have some of these highest expenses are perhaps being left in the lurch for employment?
I think that the workforce conversation, when it comes to the generational workforce, has been so tainted. As I mentioned earlier, kind of jokingly, that the conversation that's happening about Gen X right now is largely one that I think is rooted very much in white middle class iconography and sort of American back. Like, I didn't drink from a hose unless I was in Puerto Rico, right? Like we didn't all have that experience, right? And so I think that that sort of generational framing leads folks to say, well, anybody who's over 50 was, had so many advantages and their careers just turned out so great and they're just taking over. In fact, there was an article recently that said, Gen X, you have to get over the fact that you'll never be in leadership. We've completely overlooked you. We'll never have a Gen X president. We'll never have a Gen X, CEO. We'll never, just get out of the way. Right. And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. Not just get out of the way. But the assumption is, right? And I think older generations are feeling like, look, I don't want to pay my dues. And I've done a whole qualitative research study on this, right? There are different ways to approach the dues paying issue when it comes to the workplace, particularly at an intergenerational level. But that's really what we're missing, right? We're missing the idea that intergenerational workplaces are critical. We had for a year ago, people talked about 5 generations in the workforce, and then they moved on because that was no longer part of the zeitgeist, right? Now, but we can't lose sight of the fact that, again, as much as older generations want to be paid, respected, and have some sort of work-life balance, older generations want the same. And I think that this idea that because you're older, you need to kick yourself and move aside and get out of the way, particularly among older folks, is insulting. Frankly, I've spoken to older leaders who are from 50 to 65 who say this is it. This is the most critical time of my life, right? Like I want it's now or never.
Right.
So assuming that ambition is lessened just because somebody is over 50 is wrong. And assuming that we have to only allow for ambition from younger workers is also disruptive to the workplace, right? So I think partly it's because we just view different generations as expendable or, completely financially resourced when they really aren't. And so there are a lot of generational, I think, misconceptions that need to be fixed because I see a lot of millennials now who are thinking, "Oh my God, I'm in my 40s." Yeah, imagine I told you at 40 that you've got 10 more years of a work life.
Right.
And you've got 2 kids. And I mean, like, so we need to start thinking intergenerationally in order for us to come up with solutions that are intergenerational, that work for all of us, right? And there are ways to do that where older leaders say, "You know what? I don't wanna work 60 hours a week. I don't wanna do that. How about I work 30, right? How about I become fractional? How about" like, there are so many creative ways to integrate different phases of work and life, but we continue to fall back on 5 days a week in the workforce. The guy's the CEO, blah,
Yeah.
blah, blah.
It's interesting though, because I don't know, one of the, narratives in the economy that I think has been um, a bit tenuous is around gig work, right? Which is like, yes, it created this more flexibility. You could be your own boss, you could determine your own hours, wages, and sort of this, ability to work in a, maybe more unconventional way while still earning, a solid living. But I think many of the promises that we believed could come from gig work didn't really materialize. And, I was talking with someone recently who, kind of reflected like traded careers for side hustles. And, people who used to spend, 20, 25 years working at, IBM or, US Steel or Newport, at these places to really build, a foundation and afford a home and college for their kids, had to scrap together all these different, forms of employment, many of which didn't come with, health insurance or benefits or the, type of coverage that they needed. And I know you've done some thinking about, what, gig work has meant for the US economy and if it's, helping, workers or hurting workers. You talk a little bit about your thoughts there.
Sure. I mean, I think, ideally, as we mentioned earlier, so many things are connected to full-time staff employment. That includes your ability to take a vacation, your ability to get health insurance, your ability to, in many ways, contribute to your own retirement, right? Having a 401k with a company match. I know that sounds crazy. I'm not even going to talk about pensions, right? Those were relics of the past, but so many of these things were reasons why people stayed in these jobs and reasons why, the idea was to just get your degree and move up the ladder and sort of follow the American dream. Gig work came on the scene. A lot of folks said, let's give this a shot, some willingly, some unwillingly. And I think that's the key, right?
Mm,
There's a lot of folks who say, well, just start your own business. I can tell you, sitting here as someone who has done that in quotes, I guess. I don't know. I kind of still think of myself as an entrepreneur, but also a journalist. I can tell you that it takes money, it takes time, it takes connections, it takes resources. This notion that you just start a business, or like I know
right.
some people who are like, I'm going to start a nonprofit, and in 2 years are up and running and have, you know, donations and everything. Folks, people aren't being completely transparent. Okay. They're really not. They're showing you the Facebook reel of how to build this thing. We need to start having more open conversations about things like funding, things like business support, things like, how do you get yourself off the ground if you've never been an entrepreneur, right? How do you make these massive pivots that people are asking us to make right now, oftentimes inadvertently, right? And also start being realistic that it's not just a question of I'll tell you this, every single journalist that I have spoken to who has made the pivot into non-journalism work, say communications, marketing, politics, all of them said the same thing because I've been interviewing a bunch of them for a while. All of them said the same thing. Oh, somebody gave me a chance. So they didn't necessarily have the in. I mean, they had the in, they may not have had the exact background, but somebody said, "You know what? Because of your background, your pedigree, I know you and I like you, I'll give you a shot." We don't have enough of that. We rely excessively on networks, and networks only work for people who have networks. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is you're more likely to have a successful network if people can tap you for things for their own network, right? So we talk about reliance on networks, but let's be real. Okay, networks like to be around networks that can support them, right? It's all a self-serving machine. And so frankly, this makes it more difficult for people to, to get out on their own, right? And to really do that. That said, there is an opportunity there. How much of an opportunity do we consider Uber Eats, or DoorDash or setting up a Substack, for example, and trying to get payments? Like I couldn't live on any of that. Barely on the things that I get paid for now. And what happens, particularly in the knowledge economy, when it comes to gig work, and a lot of us will, and I consider journalism part of the knowledge economy,
Yeah.
is that you'll start to see your prices drop, right? Like I fortunately can command a pretty decent rate for the work that I do, but that's because I have 20 years of experience writing for the New York Times and other places. And even then, the price, can continue to there's pressure on pricing because of AI now. So I think gig work is the solution for a very, very small number of folks. And it helps to have a second income. It helps to have health insurance. If you don't have those things, it can be an enormous amount of pressure for folks.
Yeah, I feel like there's some interesting image or narrative between like the web and the ladder, right? It's like you have these, connections, right, that can, help open up doors for you, give you career advice, interviews. There's a lot of interesting research in the last handful of years that goes back, to like Robert Putnam and Bowling Alone, right, on the power of, social capital and bridging networks and things like that for those types of relationships that can help you get that leg up. But yeah, there's like the Shake Shack by Barclays, where you see like hundreds of, gig workers lining up outside to, take deliveries away. And I don't imagine those are the types of, like jobs, connections, relationships that can help you, start a business or get ahead. And so thinking about how we can, shape teams, communities, schools, to help people, kind of create some of those, connections as well. And I think, yeah, it relies on, other folks who have reached that, point in their, careers or lives to, offer those, opportunities to others. You and I spend a lot of time, kind of in the beginning talking about like not always wanting to share all doom and gloom. We also spent a lot of time talking about the price of berries in the beginning. We both had young kids, and I know you also mentioned you had gone to a Driscoll's farm, which like created like terror in my, budget memory. But not talking about just doom and gloom and not just talking about berries. I want to end on a bit of a note about, what we can do to kind of address, some of these issues around unemployment, underemployment, the challenges to a variety of workers. I know you had written a piece as well about how the Democrats, had lost the working class and what we can do about it. Can you end us on a note about, some areas where we might be able to, kind of improve some of these inequalities?
I want to talk, first of all, to the gig workers and to the folks struggling to find a full time job. I want you to know it is not you. I know we hear this so much, but I really, really believe it is not personal at this point. There are so many people who are struggling right now. We are in an upside down world. And so if you haven't launched a business and have a strategic plan and haven't come up with a personal board of directors and don't have 5 funders, within a year, cut yourself some slack, please. Half the people you're seeing doing this are, they've got things going on behind the scenes that you don't know about, and so don't compare your, and it's easier said than done. I mean, it's very frustrating, but I do want you to know that there are so many folks who are, genuinely trying to figure this out. Now, my personal take is that I can't see myself getting another degree. I already have 2 of those. I'm not seeing the value of investing in something else, but what I am doing is trying to make the best of what I do have, right? So what are the skills that I have right now that I can then, use elsewhere? What are also some new opportunities that I haven't even considered? And I think and I don't want to, again, this isn't about you have to start your own business and blah, 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 but it really is about looking and saying, what am I turning a blind eye to, right? Because we're so focused on this one thing that we have to get, this one. Look, I used to host a national radio show, right? I loved that job more than any job I've ever had, right? It's not my reality right now. So it's a question, I think, of accepting, where we are, what do we have to work with, and almost turning inward a little bit and saying, okay, are there connections that I have, ignored in the past, right? Is there somebody in my LinkedIn, for example, who maybe I don't have to ask them for a job, but just a coffee, some sort of human connection. Try to make connections less transactional. I find that more genuine the connection are, sometimes it's just nice to know that you're not alone. And I really do think that if I'm speaking to the folks that are in the hiring position, open up your minds, your brains, start to think about intergenerational workplaces with more intentionality, right? We can't have a workplace in the same way you don't want to have octogenarians running the show. We want to have workplaces that represent different backgrounds, different points of view, and different levels of knowledge and experience. And I think that's really how we move forward. Oh my God, Paul, thank you so much. Let them know, Paul. I will gladly take the mic whenever they want to give it back to me. Thank you so much. I love that. And that's hopefully, I mean, hopefully, my takeaway, no pun intended, is that we need to be more human to each other. We're all out here chasing this gold ring, and frankly, behind the scenes, so much of us are, wondering, do we still have it? We have to hang in there. I mean, there's no shame in applying for a job at Costco. I'll tell you one thing. The benefits are great, so I think we need to kind of rethink what makes us happy, what makes us feel fulfilled. And maybe this current workplace drama and shit show, frankly, that we're going to isn't it. But I do want folks to know they're not alone.
Yeah, that's such an important message, I think, for us to end on, which is, yeah, how we can all work together, as, workers, employers, yeah, people who, can bring about change across a system. And yeah, thinking about, the types of actions that you want your own, employer and workplace to implement. And yeah, cutting yourself some slack because I think as we, kind of covered in this conversation, there are so many, really challenging forces going on in the economy, right now that aren't the fault of any one individual. And so recognizing that, navigating those can be, tricky, but yeah, trying to, persevere through that and thinking about, what we can do that, makes us feel happy and fulfilled is really important.
Thank you so
So
much, Jeremy. I hope
mm,
people take that. It's not BS, it's real. I really feel like that. And we're all in this together. So many folks are trying to figure this out. I think that's a message that can at least make us feel a little bit more connected.
absolutely. Well, thanks so much for the time. And yeah, looking forward to, yeah, staying in touch. And thanks everyone who joined.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Jeremy. I had a great time.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.